Sometimes, life doesn't shout its truths, it whispers them. In the smallest details. A glance. A gesture. A child playing in a park, wearing something that should have been forgotten. This is the story of a man who built an empire and lost track of time, until a simple necklace on a stranger's neck pulled him back into a past he never knew he left behind. He thought he had closed that chapter. But fate had other plans, in the shape of a little girl, a familiar charm, and a secret that had been waiting to be found. What begins as coincidence quickly unravels into something deeper, something that will challenge his identity, his priorities, and the very meaning of family. But before we begin, where are you watching this story from? Drop your country in the comments. We'd love to know. Now, let's begin. He had walked that path 100 times before. A quiet stretch of the city park, tucked away behind a line of oaks and benches no one seemed to notice anymore. It was a shortcut, a space between two meetings, nothing more. He wasn't there to rest, or to breathe, or to think. He didn't do those things. Not anymore. Time was currency in his world, and he spent it like a man who knew how to make more of it. But something pulled him that morning, not a sound, not a sight. Just a feeling. A subtle deviation in routine, like the air pressing differently on the back of his neck. He slowed down. Maybe for the first time in weeks. The sun was already high, casting filtered light through the trees. A few families dotted the lawn. A man reading the paper. A woman nursing coffee in a paper cup. Children laughing. He barely noticed any of it. Not until he saw the girl. She was spinning slowly in the grass, arms loose at her sides, humming something no one else could hear. Her dress swayed with her motion, and something glittered at her collarbone, catching the light, then vanishing, then appearing again as she moved. It wasn't the motion that stopped him. It was the object. He knew it instantly. His eyes locked on the necklace like it had been waiting for him. A small charm, silver, with a delicate pattern carved into its face, something he had designed himself, 5 years ago, for someone he thought he'd never see again. A gift meant to say, forever, before forever ran out of time. He stepped closer, not even aware that he had moved. His mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a replica. Maybe someone had copied the design. But deep down he knew. It was the original. There had only ever been one. And then, just as he reached the edge of the lawn, a woman approached from the far end. She walked briskly, her eyes scanning the area, protective, alert. She called out, voice low but sharp. The girl turned and ran to her. The woman bent to embrace her, relief flooding her face. And then she looked up. Their eyes met. Tumbroke. There was no confusion in her gaze. No hesitation. Only recognition and something behind it, something heavier. Guilt. Panic. Fear. All wrapped in 1 second of silence. He stood frozen. The woman whispered something to the girl and straightened, clearly preparing to leave. Her steps were quick now, her posture defensive. But he couldn't move. Not yet. Not until he knew. He took a step forward. She flinched, paused, then turned back, just enough for him to be sure. It was her. The woman he had loved 5 years ago. The woman who had vanished without a word. The one who had taken a part of him with her. And now, a child. A necklace. And a silence too loud to ignore. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes said everything. She had hoped he would never know. The girl tugged at her hand, asking a question. The woman nodded, distracted, and began to walk again. They left without looking back. But the silence stayed with him. He sat on a nearby bench without remembering how he got there. The city buzzed around him, but none of it touched him. His mind was racing, not with emotion, that would come later, but with facts. Dates. Timelines. Possibilities. The girl looked about 5 years old. He hadn't seen the woman since exactly then. She had disappeared right after a fight. A brutal, final conversation about direction, ambition, and the things he couldn't give. She said she needed time. He said nothing, believing that silence would end things faster than words. She left that night. And never came back. He had moved on, or so he thought. Threw himself into business. Traveled. Expanded. His company doubled in size. His net worth tripled. He replaced the ache with efficiency and the loss with distraction. But now, sitting in a public park on a wooden bench worn thin by weather and time, all of that felt hollow. Had she really kept this from him? Or had he pushed so hard that she had no choice? His mind played loops of possibilities. Had she written him? Called? Tried to tell him? Or had she just vanished, deciding on her own that he wasn't meant to be part of this chapter? And then the deeper question clawed its way to the surface. Was that child his? He stood suddenly, almost dizzy from the weight of the thought. It was too much. Too fast. Too real. The necklace still burned in his mind, an object meant to mark a promise, now wrapped around the neck of a girl he didn't know. Or rather, a girl he might have known, should have known. The next hours passed without anchor. Meetings blurred. Calls were missed. Assistants asked questions and got no answers. He was somewhere else entirely, trapped between past and present, between a decision he never made and a life he might have lost without knowing it. He returned to the park later that week. Sat on the same bench. Watched the same path. Hoping. On the third day, they returned. The girl played. The woman read a book nearby, sunglasses shielding her eyes, posture tense even from a distance. He didn't approach. Not yet. He needed to see more. To feel sure. The girl laughed, chasing after a bird, arms flailing. The sound was pure, unfiltered, and oddly familiar. There was something in the rhythm of it, something that echoed in a part of him he didn't know still worked. He watched her closely. Her gestures. Her curiosity. Her stubbornness when she fell and refused help. Pieces. Tiny, sharp pieces. That mirrored someone he used to be. By the time they left, he knew. Not because of evidence. Not because of science. Because of instinct. The kind of instinct that breaks through reason and says, "This is yours." But knowing it and proving it were different things. And accepting it? That would be the hardest part of all. He wasn't ready for what came next. But he also wasn't ready to walk away. The decision to follow them wasn't made in a single moment. It built itself slowly, like condensation on glass. Invisible at first, then impossible to ignore. Each day he returned to the park, watching from a distance, feeling like a ghost trapped between two worlds. He hadn't spoken to her yet, but the silence had grown heavy. It demanded resolution. He waited for a moment when the girl wandered far enough, her attention claimed by a makeshift game only children understand. The woman sat on a bench, eyes distracted by a paperback she never turned the page on. Her shoulders were tense, her hands restless. She was pretending to relax, but he saw the performance in her every movement. He approached slowly. Not with anger. Not with confrontation. But with purpose. She noticed him before he spoke. Her body stiffened and she lowered the book. There was no surprise in her expression. Only resignation. For a moment, they stood in the thick fog of everything unsaid. He didn't ask the question directly. And she didn't deny what he already knew. The necklace had done the speaking for both of them. What followed was not an argument, but a confession, scattered, halting, lined with memories sharp as broken glass. She told him she had discovered the pregnancy weeks after he left for Asia on what was supposed to be a 3-month expansion tour. They hadn't ended things formally. Not really. But the space between them had already begun to stretch into something permanent. She wrote to him, once, but deleted the message before sending. She tried again, then changed her mind. She said she was afraid. Not of him, but of who he had become. Of the version of him that she had watched harden over the years into someone who measured everything in efficiency, returns, and leverage. She had loved him truly, but she had also mourned the parts of him that business and ambition had slowly buried. And when she pictured telling him about the child, all she could see was a negotiation. She said she didn't want to be a footnote in a PR strategy. Didn't want the child growing up in a fortress of glass and calendars, raised by nannies while decisions were made from jet cabins. She believed, in that moment, that disappearing was the most loving thing she could do, for the child and for herself. He listened in silence. Not because he agreed, but because arguing would have been too easy. Too familiar. And none of it would change what had already happened. But as she spoke, a cold pressure formed behind his ribs. A quiet fury, not the explosive kind, but the type that simmers. She had taken 5 years from him. 5 birthdays. 5 winters. First words. First steps. Scraped knees and sleepy hugs and bedtime stories. Locked away by someone who had once looked him in the eye and promised partnership. When he finally responded, his voice was quiet. She flinched not at the volume, but at the stillness in it. Because silence, when spoken by someone who usually commands rooms, is far more dangerous than rage. She didn't argue. Instead, she apologized, the kind of apology that has no neat ribbon, no repair strategy. Just truth, raw and jagged. Then came the question he never wanted to ask, but couldn't avoid. Was the child his? She nodded. Slowly. Without hesitation. The ground beneath him shifted. He sat down beside her, not because he wanted closeness, but because standing felt impossible. He needed the earth under him. Something real. Something to hold him still. The child ran over moments later, unaware of the gravity in the air, babbling about a bird she had seen. The woman smiled and pulled her close, placing a hand protectively over the charm at her neck, as if it could hide everything it had already revealed. He looked at the girl. Really looked. She looked nothing like him. At least, not in any obvious way. But then again, genetics had a cruel sense of humor. It didn't matter. He didn't need a test. The ache in his chest was proof enough. They parted without ceremony. No agreements. No decisions. Just a mutual awareness that the silence between them had been shattered, and something irreversible had taken its place. The following days were harder. He couldn't return to his routine. Everything now felt wrong. The office, the boardrooms, the meetings about expansion and scale and investor confidence. He stared out of windows and saw nothing but a small girl spinning in a public park. He reviewed the timeline obsessively, backtracked events, tried to reconstruct what he had missed. But no amount of analysis could return the years. He sent a message. Not a demand, not an ultimatum, just a request to meet. Not in a restaurant, not in a formal setting, but in a quiet cafe near the edge of town where no one would recognize them. She arrived late. He didn't mind. This time, there was less defensiveness. Less distance. They talked about real things. The child. Her routines. Her favorite colors. The school she would start soon. The bedtime stories she liked. The foods she refused to eat. The friends she already had. It was all so normal. And yet it felt like he was reading the biography of someone he had failed to meet. He asked about her finances. She avoided the topic. He asked again, more directly. She relented. Things weren't easy. She worked 2 jobs. Lived in a modest apartment. Did everything herself. No help. No child support. No family nearby. Just resilience and exhaustion wrapped in polite smiles. He offered to help. She refused. Not because of pride, but because she was afraid of what help might mean. Control. Entanglement. Expectations. He asked if she would let him spend time with the child. She paused, then said yes. The next afternoon, he sat on a blanket in the park, a coloring book between them, trying not to cry when the girl handed him a crayon and told him to stay in the lines. He didn't care about the lines. He only cared that she had spoken to him, that she had smiled, that she had laughed. And in that fragile moment, surrounded by the sound of children playing and dogs barking and a city alive with things that had nothing to do with him, something inside him changed. He wasn't sure what came next. But he knew what he couldn't do, walk away. The rhythm of his life had once been a metronome. Precise, reliable, forward-moving. It ticked in calendar appointments, echoed in footsteps across marble floors, beat in the rise and fall of quarterly reports. But now, every minute felt uneven. A stutter in time, a skip in tempo that left him suspended between past and present. He had a daughter. The sentence repeated itself in his mind, never settling, always circling back with more weight than before. Each time they met, he saw more of her, in the way she squinted when thinking hard, the tilt of her head when asking a question, the way her laughter filled spaces he didn't realize were silent. And each detail was another drop in a bucket he hadn't known he'd been trying to fill. He became obsessed with the missing years. He tried to reconstruct them, month by month, milestone by milestone. He wanted to understand where he had been when she had taken her first steps. What he was doing the day she said her first word. How many nights she had cried without knowing his name. He wanted to believe he could reclaim some of it by knowing. But memory doesn't work like that. You can't trade knowledge for time. He visited the apartment where they lived, not inside, not at first. Just outside. Observing. Trying to see their lives as they were. A modest building, chipped paint on the staircase, laundry flapping from windows. A community of noise and survival. Children shouting, mothers calling from windows, dogs barking through cracked gates. He saw her leaving early in the morning, dragging a backpack and a sleepy child behind her. He followed, carefully, distantly, until they reached a daycare, then a bus stop. She worked at a clinic, then cleaned offices in the evening. Between the two jobs, she picked up her daughter, brought her home, fed her, helped with homework, and collapsed into sleep on the couch. It broke him. Not because she struggled, but because she had done it all alone. He began sending anonymous help. Nothing flashy. Just relief. A rent payment here, groceries delivered, bills mysteriously disappearing. She noticed, of course. And she confronted him. He didn't deny it. She was furious at first. Told him it wasn't his place. That money wasn't a substitute for presence. That 5 years of absence couldn't be erased with transactions. But underneath the anger was something else, exhaustion. She was tired. And he saw that. Not just in her words, but in the way her voice faltered when she said she was managing. He told her he didn't want to manage anything. He just wanted to be allowed in. To be there. She didn't answer. Instead, she started letting him spend more time with the child. At first, the visits were supervised, cautious. Parks. Ice cream. Story time at the library. She watched closely, eyes always on her daughter, scanning for discomfort, unease, signs of fear. But none came. Instead, there was curiosity, then laughter, then questions. Why does he talk like that? Why does he wear the same shoes all the time? Can we go see him tomorrow? The questions sliced through him, beautiful and painful. He began to adjust his schedule around her. Moved meetings. Missed calls. Let emails pile. For the first time in his adult life, he put someone, above the company he had built. It unsettled his board. His assistant asked if he was sick. Investors whispered. But he didn't care. Not really. One afternoon, while sitting cross-legged on the living room rug of their apartment, helping with a puzzle too complex for her age but perfect for her mind, she called him by a name he hadn't expected. It wasn't Sir. It wasn't his first name. It was simpler, smaller, but heavier, and it undid him. He held himself together until he left the building. Then he sat in his car for nearly an hour, unable to move, staring at the steering wheel, the dashboard, the reflection of himself in the windshield. Not the version of him from before. Not the $1,000,000 suit. Not the jet-set traveler. Just a man who had missed everything that mattered. The woman, meanwhile, was changing too. She saw how the child responded to him. Saw the calm in her eyes when he was around. The joy. The questions about where he was, when he'd return. And she began to wonder if she had done the right thing after all. She had spent years protecting her daughter from a man she believed was too distant, too consumed, too cold. But now she saw something else. A man unlearning everything he thought he knew about importance. Still, it wasn't easy. Trust didn't regenerate overnight. She had built her world on independence. On strength. On surviving without help. Allowing him in meant admitting she had been wrong. About him. About herself. One night, as she watched them from the kitchen, heads bent over a drawing, giggles filling the tiny room, she felt something unfamiliar, the absence of fear. And in its place, the flicker of hope. He didn't push. Didn't offer keys or grand promises. He just showed up. Every time. Without fail. When the child caught a cold, he brought soup and sat on the couch, watching cartoons he didn't understand. When she lost a tooth, he took her to the dentist. When she had a nightmare, he came over and waited until she fell asleep again. No cameras. No credit. Just presence. And in those quiet moments, the space between what was and what could be began to narrow. He still mourned the lost years. But now, he had something more powerful than regret. He had today. There was a moment, brief, barely noticeable, when she realized how much her world had shifted. It wasn't during a dramatic confession or a tearful reunion. It came on an ordinary Tuesday, while folding laundry in silence. She reached into the basket and pulled out a child's shirt, then another. Then, unexpectedly, a man's dress shirt, neatly ironed and misplaced in the pile. She stared at it for a long time before folding it with trembling hands. That shirt didn't belong to her. But it was in her home. Somehow, without force or fanfare, he had entered their lives. Not as an outsider, not as a visitor, but as someone whose presence had taken root. She hadn't planned for this. For years, she had shaped her days around survival. Not in the dramatic, cinematic sense, but in the way working mothers survive. Schedules, lists, alarms, buses. She had learned how to live within narrow margins. How to smile through exhaustion, how to make joy out of crumbs, how to keep a child laughing even when rent was overdue. It wasn't a tragic life. It was just quiet. Familiar. And now, it was different. He came by often, not just for the child, but for her too. Not romantically, not yet. But with intention. He helped with dishes. Replaced a broken lock without being asked. Picked up groceries on his way. Remembered things no one else ever did. Her favorite tea, her daughter's bedtime routine, the old lullaby she used to hum on hard nights. And slowly, something unfamiliar crept in. Resentment. Not toward him, but toward herself. For choosing to do it alone. For believing that love and partnership were luxuries she couldn't afford. For assuming that because he had left once, he would never stay. She had painted him as a villain to make peace with her choices. But the man standing in her kitchen, tying an apron awkwardly to help with dinner, didn't fit the role anymore. And that terrified her. Because letting him in meant questioning everything she had built. She had raised a daughter who was kind, curious, full of light. She had done it without nannies, without private schools, without trust funds. Her child had scraped knees, secondhand shoes, and a fierce sense of self-worth. And part of her was proud of that. But now, with this man folding paper boats out of napkins at the dinner table, she saw something else. The kind of fatherhood she never thought possible. Softness. Presence. Patience. One evening, the child asked if he was going to live with them. The question landed like thunder in the silence. She changed the subject quickly, but her heart raced long after the conversation had passed. Later that week, she tried to pull away. Told him maybe he was doing too much. That maybe the girl was getting too attached. That this wasn't sustainable. He didn't argue. Just nodded and left. And his absence, even for a day, felt heavier than it should have. The child noticed. Asked where he was. Waited by the window. Drew pictures of him at school. That night, she sat alone in the dark, facing the brutal truth. She was afraid. Not of him, but of the risk of needing someone again. It was easier to survive than to trust. He returned the next day, not because she asked, but because he sensed the space and chose not to honor it. Instead, he brought a small wooden box, worn, hand-carved, and unfamiliar. Inside, he had placed everything he had missed. A notebook of thoughts he had written since their reunion, printed photos from the days he had spent with the girl, ticket stubs, tiny drawings she had made, a pressed flower from the first park day. A record of memories he couldn't afford to lose again. He left the box on her kitchen table and said nothing. Later that night, she opened it again, slowly, carefully, and wept. The next morning, things resumed. As if nothing had happened. But everything had. He began to speak to her differently, not with plans, but with questions. What did she want for her future? What did she dream of, if she had space to dream? If money wasn't a weight, if time wasn't an enemy? She had never thought of that. He suggested things gently, better schools, a safer neighborhood, options. Not charity. Not pity. Possibility. But possibility can feel like an insult when you've built an entire identity around endurance. She snapped once, told him she didn't need saving. He said he knew. He wasn't there to save her. He was there to walk beside her. She had no answer for that. Weeks passed. The months. He invited them to visit his home. Not to move in. Just to see it. To spend a weekend. She hesitated. But the girl, thrilled, packed her small bag with delight and ran to the door before she could say no. The house was everything she expected, vast, immaculate, intimidating. But strangely warm. There were toys already waiting. Clothes in the right size. Her favorite cereal. A toothbrush with a little cartoon sticker. None of it felt accidental. That night, after the child fell asleep, they sat in the living room. No wine. No pretense. Just silence. She looked around at the walls, the space, the weight of what this man had become, and how far her world was from his. And he said, softly, almost absent-mindedly, that it didn't matter what she saw. Because everything that mattered was now asleep in the next room. And maybe, just maybe, this house was too big for one person. The invitation came from the smallest voice in the house. It happened during an evening storm, when the air was heavy and the windows shimmered with quiet rain. The girl had been drawing at the kitchen counter, tongue peeking out in concentration, while her mother reheated leftovers and he absent-mindedly folded napkins into triangles, just to keep his hands busy. It was a scene so ordinary that none of them noticed how extraordinary it had become. Then the girl looked up and asked the question that neither adult had dared to voice. Can we have dinner like this every day? There was no answer. Only stillness. Because in that moment, everything they'd been dancing around, the cautious visits, the silent longing, the unspoken fears, collapsed under the weight of a child's innocent wish. After she fell asleep, they sat at opposite ends of the couch, staring at the TV but watching nothing. The question lingered in the room like the scent of rain. He spoke first. Not with declarations or proposals. Just an observation that whatever this was, felt right. She didn't deny it. But her silence wasn't agreement. It was worry, coiled tight around her ribs. She had built walls, slowly and deliberately, and now a child's voice had cracked through them in seconds. Still, something shifted that night. The next morning, he arrived early with breakfast. Not just for the child, for all three of them. The gesture wasn't grand. It was simple, intentional, warm. The kind of thing people do when they belong somewhere. And that's when the pattern changed. What started as weekends turned into weekdays. She stopped protesting when he offered to pick the girl up from school. He began showing up with groceries not because they needed them, but because he wanted to know what they liked. He stayed longer. Left later. One afternoon turned into dinner. Then 2 nights in a row. It wasn't discussed. It just happened. She started finding his belongings around the apartment. A watch on the sink, socks on the floor, a book on the nightstand. Not left carelessly, but naturally, as if they'd always been there. She watched it unfold with a kind of reverence. And fear. Because peace, for someone who has lived in chaos, always feels like a trap. But it wasn't chaos that visited next, it was clarity. It came one evening when she overheard her daughter talking to a friend on the phone. Laughing. Telling stories about my daddy. So casual, so certain. No questions. No hesitation. She froze at the doorway. The words struck something deep inside. Not because it was wrong, but because it felt so impossibly right. She had been holding on to an idea. That family had to be something fought for, earned, proven. But here was this small girl, crafting her own truth without permission. And perhaps that truth mattered more than anything else. She sat him down that weekend. Not to define the relationship. Not to push him away. But to ask a question she never thought she'd ask. What would a future with us look like? He didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He simply answered. Not with promises of luxury or grand solutions, but with intentions. That he wanted to be part of their everyday. That he didn't want to replace what she had built, but add to it. That he saw a life where the child grew up surrounded not by wealth, but by presence. Not by noise, but by laughter. She listened, uncertain, but open. He showed her a plan, not for her, not to control, but to build together. A new home, designed to hold all three of their lives without erasing hers. A place with space for memories yet to be made. Nothing ostentatious. Nothing untouchable. He didn't want them to adapt to his world. He wanted to create a new one. They visited the property a week later. It was a modest house by his standards, but to her, it felt unreal. A backyard where the girl could run. A kitchen with room for 3 at the table. Light in every room. She stood in the doorway and tried to imagine mornings there. Music playing. Breakfast burning. A child laughing. And someone else, not just beside her, but with her. Still, fear lingered. So he did something unexpected. He took her back to her own apartment. Sat her down on the same couch where they had shared the quietest, hardest conversations. And he said, "If this is where you feel most yourself, we can stay here." That was the moment she understood. He wasn't asking her to follow him. He was inviting her to lead. And for the first time, she said yes. They didn't move immediately. They took their time. Let the transition unfold like seasons. She packed slowly, carefully, holding each object like a memory. He stayed beside her the entire time, not directing, not rushing. Just present. The child adjusted faster than anyone expected. She drew pictures of the new house before they moved. Picked her room. Named it. Made rules. The night they finally slept under the same roof, it rained again. Soft, steady, gentle. And for the first time in years, none of them felt like guests in their own lives. There were no speeches. No declarations. Just a table set for 3. A place for every piece that had once been lost. It didn't happen overnight. The transformation came quietly, like the way fog lifts in the early morning. Unnoticed at first, until suddenly the world looks different. They learned to live together, not as 3 people coexisting in a shared space, but as something more fluid, more whole. It wasn't about roles, father, mother, daughter, but about presence. About rhythm. About the way 3 separate lives slowly began to move in harmony. There were adjustments. He had to unlearn control. Not every dish needed to be loaded his way, not every toy needed to be picked up on schedule. She had to unlearn self-containment, to let someone help, to let someone see her when she was tired, angry, lost. The child, young and boundless, adjusted the fastest. She simply loved, openly, freely, and in doing so, taught them how to follow. There were setbacks too. Moments when tension rose out of nowhere. When past pain resurfaced unexpectedly. When fear whispered that it was all too good, too fragile. But they faced those moments differently now. Not with silence. Not with retreat. But with conversation. With honesty. With the slow, unfamiliar act of trusting that they wouldn't walk away again. He changed. Not in the way most people imagine change. Not a dramatic reinvention. Not some grand spiritual awakening. He still worked. Still wore his suits. Still answered too many emails. But the weight of his ambition shifted. It was no longer about legacy or empire. It became about time, how to give it, how to be in it. He started canceling meetings to make room for dance recitals. Left early for school pickups. Took conference calls in the car while parked outside ballet class. His assistant was baffled. His investors noticed. But for the first time in his life, he didn't care. She changed too. She began to laugh more freely, not the tired laughter she'd mastered over the years, but something looser, lighter. She stopped watching over her shoulder, stopped waiting for the ground to give out. She started dreaming again, not for survival, but for expansion. She took a course she'd postponed for years. Reconnected with friends she'd drifted from. Found the version of herself that had been waiting underneath the weight of single motherhood. The child bloomed. With both of them there, consistently she began to shine in new ways. Her questions deepened. Her creativity soared. Her sense of safety became visible in her posture, in her voice, in the way she leaned into hugs instead of bracing for them. And then one day she brought home a drawing. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a crooked little house. Each had a heart drawn on their chest. Above them, in shaky handwriting, she had written, "S." He took the picture and framed it that night. They hung it in the hallway, not above the fireplace, not in his office, but in the space they all passed through every day. A reminder, a promise. Their days settled into a kind of grace. Mornings were full of shared routines, mismatched breakfasts, rushing to find shoes, forgotten lunchboxes. Evenings were slower, stories read aloud, puzzles half-finished, dishes washed with music playing low in the background. No one called it perfect, but it was real. And real was enough. He no longer felt haunted by the years he'd missed. He still thought about them, the first steps, the birthdays, the questions he never got to answer. But now, instead of guilt, he felt something else, a quiet gratitude for the second chance he'd been given. She no longer felt alone in her victories or her exhaustion. She had someone to lean on, someone who saw the invisible labor behind every small triumph, someone who noticed when she needed rest, even when she wouldn't ask for it. And the child. Well, she no longer drew only 2 figures in her family portraits. There were always 3. Eventually, they celebrated their first full year together. There was no party, no announcements, just a dinner at home, the 3 of them, candles flickering, laughter bouncing off the walls. He looked at them across the table and realized something profound. Everything he had once chased, prestige, applause, legacy, had never truly belonged to him. But this quiet moment, this shared meal, this table for 3, this was his. In the months that followed, they traveled, not to luxury resorts or remote islands, but to small places with meaning. The town where she grew up, the city where they first met, a cabin in the mountains where the child saw snow for the first time. They built memories, not to replace the ones they'd missed, but to fill the space ahead. Eventually, the whispers faded. The ones from colleagues, from the media, from people who couldn't understand why a man like him would trade meetings for bedtime stories. He didn't answer those whispers. He didn't need to. Because the girl who once wore a necklace he gave to someone he thought he'd lost now sat beside him every evening, alive, curious his. And the woman who had once feared his world now shared it, not as a guest, but as a partner. Their family didn't begin in the usual way. It wasn't planned. It wasn't clean. It was messy, full of absence and repair. But it was theirs. And in the end, that's all that mattered. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story stirred something inside you, if it made you reflect, remember, or hope, consider subscribing. We share stories like this to remind ourselves that healing is possible, and that sometimes the people we're meant to find were never really lost. Now we'd love to hear from you. What part of this story touched you the most? Scroll down and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time.